15th November, 1944. A nondescript stone building on the outskirts of Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. The frost has settled early this year, glazing the footpaths between the huts in a thin silver skin. Inside, a man in a rumpled civilian suit leans over a wooden bench, adjusting the last component of a device no larger than a hardback novel. He doesn't look up when the door opens. He doesn't need to. The footsteps belong to the same American liaison officer who has visited 3 times this week, and each time the answer has been the same. Not yet. Not quite. Almost. The American pauses behind him, watching the careful, deliberate movements of a man who understands that the margin between success and catastrophe is measured in thousandths of an inch. On the bench, surrounded by handwritten notes and empty teacups, sits what will eventually be described in a classified American intelligence memo as potentially the single most valuable piece of compact technology produced by any Allied nation during the entire course of the war. That memo will remain sealed for nearly 4 decades. What the American is looking at is, to the untrained eye, unremarkable. A small metal box, a tangle of wires, a mechanism so modest in its physical presence that the cleaning staff at the facility reportedly walked past it for months without curiosity. But inside that box is something that will alter the nature of intelligence, communication, and cryptographic warfare in ways that neither the Germans nor the Japanese, and for some time not even most of the British, will fully understand. This is the story of the Type X machine and the extraordinary network of mines, manufacturing facilities, and operational secrecy that surrounded it. It is a story about a country that had learned, through bitter experience and centuries of imperial communication, that the ability to speak in secret is not merely an advantage. It is the difference between survival and annihilation. It is a story that the British told no one, shared with almost no one, and protected at a cost that is still, to this day, not fully known. To understand why this matters, you have to go back before the war, before the bombs, before the beaches. You have to go back to a world in which every major power is watching every other major power, with the barely concealed anxiety of men who know that the next conflict will be unlike anything that came before it. By the mid-1930s, the nature of military communication has changed beyond recognition. Armies do not march in neat columns that can be observed from a hillside. Navies do not signal one another with lanterns across a visible stretch of water. The battlefield has expanded into the air, beneath the sea, across thousands of miles of contested territory, and the problem of how to communicate across all of that space, quickly, reliably, and above all secretly, has become the central obsession of every military intelligence establishment on Earth. The Germans had arrived at their answer first, or at least they believed they had. The Enigma machine, commercially available in the 1920s and steadily militarized throughout the following decade, was by the late 1930s the backbone of German military communications. It was, by the standards of the time, a genuine marvel of cryptographic engineering, a polyalphabetic substitution, cipher driven by a series of rotating mechanical wheels. It produced enciphered text of such apparent complexity that German military intelligence assessed, with considerable confidence, that it was effectively unbreakable. The number of possible configurations ran into the hundreds of trillions. No enemy cryptanalyst working with pencil and paper could hope to break a message before its operational relevance had long since expired. The British, to their enduring credit, did not accept this assessment. They had been thinking about the problem longer and more carefully than the Germans realized, and they had concluded that the real weakness of any mechanical cipher was not mathematical, but systemic. Machines could be captured. Code books could be stolen. Operators could be lazy, repetitive, predictable. But the British also understood something else, something the Germans had not fully reckoned with. If you are going to intercept enemy communications at scale, and by 1939, the British were already doing exactly that from a network of listening stations that stretched from the south coast of England to the outer edges of empire. You need not only the ability to break enemy codes, you need the ability to protect your own. This is where the Type X and its successor variants entered history. The Type X was not born in a moment of dramatic inspiration. It grew gradually and pragmatically from work that had begun in the late 1920s within the British Foreign Office and the Signals Intelligence Directorate that would eventually become GCHQ. The initial design drew, frankly and without embarrassment, from the same commercial roots as Enigma. Both machines shared an ancestor in the work of the Dutch inventor Alexander Koch and the German engineer Arthur Scherbius. The British engineers, working primarily through a team attached to the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, though early development was conducted at Eastcote and later Cheltenham, made no secret of this lineage in their internal documentation. What they made secret, with extraordinary thoroughness, was everything else. The Type X, in its mature wartime form, was a 5-wheel polyalphabetic cipher machine driven by an electric typewriter mechanism. Where Enigma used 3 wheels, with an optional 4th for naval variants, the Type X used 5 as its standard configuration, with the wheels themselves being interchangeable in both order and wiring. The additional 2 wheels did not simply add to the number of possible configurations in a linear sense. The mathematics of permutation meant that the increase in cryptographic complexity was effectively exponential. A German analyst confronting an intercepted Type X message, even one who understood the basic operating principles of the machine, was facing a problem of a categorically different order from the one that confronted the British analysts working on Enigma. But the genius of the Type X was not merely in the number of wheels. The British engineers had introduced 2 innovations that the Enigma designers had either not considered or had considered and dismissed. The first was a series of additional plugboard settings, similar in concept to the Enigma Stecker, but more complex in application, that were changed not daily but multiple times per day on high-security circuits. The second was a mechanical paper tape input and output system, allowing messages to be pre-prepared offline and transmitted at speed, reducing the exposure of the encipherment process to interception. The machine weighed approximately 50 kilograms in its carrying case, roughly comparable to a large military field radio, and could be operated by a trained signals officer at a rate sufficient for operational military communication in all but the most demanding circumstances. Manufacturing was distributed across several sites in the English Midlands, with final assembly and testing conducted under strict compartmentalization at facilities whose precise locations were withheld even from many of the operators who used the machines in the field. Estimates based on post-war declassification and subsequent research suggest that somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 units were produced across the various Type X variants during the war years, though exact figures remain uncertain. What is not uncertain is the geographic reach of the machines. They served in every theatre of the war, from the North African desert to the jungles of Burma, from the convoy routes of the North Atlantic to the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In the field, the Type X functioned as the secure backbone of British and Commonwealth High Command communications throughout the war. When General Bernard Montgomery issued the orders that preceded the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, the communications traffic that coordinated that operation moved in significant part through Type X enciphered channels. When the planning for Operation Overlord the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, required the transmission of orders and intelligence assessments between London, Washington, and the commanders in the field. Type X machines formed a critical part of the secure communications architecture. There are accounts, fragmented and sometimes difficult to verify, of Type X machines being operated under fire, of signals officers in North Africa working the machines in the back of lorries with the desert heat warping the air around them, the mechanism running hot, the operator wiping sweat from his hands before touching the keys, of machines in Burma wrapped in oilcloth against the monsoon rains and carried on the backs of local porters through terrain that no wheeled vehicle could navigate. The machines did not always survive these conditions. Some were destroyed by their operators to prevent capture, following procedures that had been drilled into every trained user. Records of these destructions are sparse, but the standing orders were clear and were evidently followed, because no intact operational Type X machine is known to have fallen into Axis hands during the war. The German attempts to produce a comparable system are instructive. The Lorenz cipher machine, the SZ40 and its successor, the SZ42, was in some respects a more sophisticated device than Enigma, designed specifically for high-level teleprinter communications between the German Army High Command and its field commanders. It used 12 wheels rather than the Type X's 5, and its theoretical complexity was enormous. But it was also large, expensive to manufacture, and operationally limited in its deployment. Only senior headquarters used it. The bulk of German military communication continued to rely on Enigma variants, which the British were reading with increasing facility throughout the war. The Germans never achieved the combination of security, portability, and operational reach that the Type X represented. The American approach was different again. The Sagaba machine, developed through a collaboration between the U.S. Army Signal Corps and the Navy Cryptographic Office, was in many respects the American equivalent of the Type X, and in some technical particulars it was arguably superior. It used 15 rotors compared to the Type X's 5, and American cryptanalysts assessed it as unbroken throughout the war. But Sagaba was larger, heavier, and more complex to operate. It weighed in the region of 135 kilograms, nearly 3 times the Type X, and was effectively impossible to deploy in the forward areas where the Type X regularly operated. The British machine went where the fighting was. The American machine, by and large, stayed in headquarters. This difference was not lost on American intelligence. The wartime assessment that described the Type X as potentially the single most valuable piece of compact technology produced by any Allied nation was not hyperbole. It reflected a genuine appreciation of what the British had achieved, a machine that was secure enough to protect the most sensitive communications of the war, robust enough to function in extreme environmental conditions, and portable enough to travel with the fighting forces wherever they went. The legacy of the Type X is not easy to separate from the broader legacy of British wartime signals intelligence, which is itself still being fully understood. The work done at Bletchley Park, the breaking of Enigma, the penetration of Lorenz, the creation of Colossus, has received enormous attention in the decades since declassification began in the 1970s. The story of how the British protected their own communications has received rather less. This is partly a function of classification. Much of the detailed technical documentation relating to Type X variants and their deployment remained restricted well into the 1980s, and some elements of the operational record may never be fully released. What can be said with confidence is this. Throughout the Second World War, the British conducted their most sensitive military communications through a system that the Axis powers were, as far as current evidence indicates, entirely unable to break. The intelligence asymmetry this created, the British reading German traffic while the Germans read nothing, was not merely an advantage. It was, in certain operations, the decisive factor. The ability to plan, knowing what the enemy knew, to move without fear that the movement had been betrayed, to coordinate at the highest levels with confidence in the security of the channel. This is what the Type X made possible. Surviving examples of the Type X and its variants can be found at the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, at the Smithsonian in Washington, and in the collection of the National Cryptologic Museum in Maryland, where it sits in a glass case a short distance from the American Cigaba, and a collection of captured Enigma machines. Visitors often pause longest at the Enigma. It has the glamour of the defeated, the mystique of the broken. The Type X stands quietly beside it, smaller than most people expect, its metal casing worn to a dull sheen by decades of handling. It does not invite the same instinctive drama. But then it never needed to. Return now to that stone building in Bletchley. November 1944. The frost outside, the teacups on the bench, the American liaison officer waiting at the door. The man in the rumpled suit sets down his tools and straightens. He looks at the machine on the bench and then looks at the American, and the expression on his face is not pride exactly. It is the expression of a man who has spent years solving a problem that most people do not know exists, for a purpose that cannot be explained, in service of an outcome that will not be acknowledged. He will not receive a medal for this work. His name will not appear in the dispatches. The machine on the bench will be classified, transported, operated, and eventually archived with a thoroughness that will ensure the public knows almost nothing of its existence for the better part of half a century. The American will return to Washington with his assessment, which will be buried in a filing cabinet in a building that will itself eventually be demolished. The frost will melt. The war will end. And throughout all of it, through the desert and the monsoon and the mud and the wire and the bodies and the years, a small metal box no larger than a hardback novel will have carried the secrets of an empire through the worst war in human history and delivered them, intact and unread, to the other side. The Germans built a machine the world would never stop talking about. The British built one it was never supposed to know existed. That is the difference between a cipher and a secret. And the British, in this as in so many things, had understood the difference long before anyone thought to ask.